Okay, thank you, Imran. My focus will come later.
Okay.
Let me start with an element that you touched upon when you introduced the session, when you talked about geography that does not change. Mm-hmm. Well, yes, it does not change, but sometimes it does because it's of the making of us as human beings, especially political geography. But let me go back to something that is unchanging, that all our discussion revolves around, which is the security threat itself. It's as old as us human beings since we inhabited and settled on this earth. This threat has been with us and will remain with us. We all remember the famous saying of Hobbes that man is a wolf to men, which goes even back to the Greek tradition, where we find a similar saying that homo homini lupus, it's exactly the Latin term for man is a wolf to men. So it's something that resides with us for a long, long time. In more recent times, we learn in international relations the concept of the security dilemma in most of the approaches, but in a bigger scope. It's not the man who is a threat to man, it's the states who are threat to states. So every state is a security threat to other states. This is really embedded or grounded in our human being, in our societies, in our political organization, which is the state. So this is the unchanging element that all the other discussion revolves around. Now let me come to the changing elements or the changing forms of conflicts, which makes the discussion timely, because security threat is always there. But what is changing are the forms of security threats, are the characteristics of actors, are which is changing is the ways we respond to those threats. This is what makes our discussion relevant and timely. So if we try to analyze the environments that have changed over the last decades when it comes to the Middle East region, I have 4 points to mention. The first one is the post-colonial era, where most of the liberation movements turned into political parties and started establishing political entities, states, parties, and all this. Of course, this brought with it a number of security challenges when they built or constructed the security machinery, the armies, and all this. The second phase or the second environment after the post-colonial era is the Cold War. The Cold War, of course, it divided the world into big camps, East and West, and it also divided our region into camps, aligning some with the West, some with the East. This maximized the fear of states from the other states. Sometimes we find the state aligning with the West, neighboring state aligning with the East, and that adds a lot to the security threats. The third environment is, I would say, the September 11 event and the war on terror that started at that point and was generalized to encompass the whole world, and of course our region is part of it, and that brought with it another number of security challenges that are different from the ones before. And the fourth environment that started a few years ago is the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, this phenomena that is political and social in essence, but it also brought with it a number of security challenges and a number of conflicts that are different from the ones before. September 11 weakened some states. They made it easier for individuals for organizations, for funds, for arms to move around. And it also made across the region or parts of the region training camps for organizations to train and to acquire experience or expertise and to move around. Let me come third to North Africa, the focus of this speech. Of course, it's not an exception to what happened during those four environments. We all know that North Africa was the area where the Arab Spring started. This is in regard to the Arab Spring. Started in Tunisia, then Libya, then Algeria. Morocco is also regarded as part of this process. We have a country in North Africa that has no state. Yesterday and today we've been talking about states and non-state actors. Now we have a country with no state. So that's the third, I think, model to talk about. It's a country with no state. It represents or presents us with a different way of dealing with the challenges that brings with it. When it comes to the post-colonial era, North Africa inhabited or inherited a number of issues from border disputes between, let's say, Algeria and Morocco, between Libya and Tunisia. Some of those disputes evolved into full-fledged wars, like the Sands War in 1963 between Algeria and Morocco. And the Cold War also divided North Africa, as it did with the other parts of the world, into East and West. We have a number of socialist countries and a number of liberal countries, if I may. And even if every one of these countries neighbored with a different country with a different political system. So I think I will end here, Imran.
Okay.
And I have just one last point I will make maybe later on in the discussion with regard to what kind of security architecture we need to develop according to those 4 points I came with.
Just as I did with Jared, just before we move on, I have a question for you before we move on to our next speaker. You're a native of Tunisia, right? Do you feel we're constantly playing catch up here? Because we're used to the phenomenon of, say, terrorism and armed groups and armed uprisings in countries which are failing or failed states. So you can talk of Libya, you can talk of Somalia over the years, South Sudan, and so on and so forth, Iraq, Syria. You mentioned the Arab Spring. So you have Tunisia, you have a successful revolution, you have a democracy, ostensibly things are good, but you still have a situation where, for example, the country is producing an extraordinarily high amount of Daesh fighters that go off as foreign fighters. So with that in mind, are we constantly having to analyze this thing in retrospect? Are we always struggling to put out these fires and playing this game of whack-a-mole, as they call it? Because with Tunisia, you could not have foreseen the fact that so many young people would join Daesh as foreign fighters.
This is one of the most difficult questions to ask. Tunisia is regarded as one of the most modernist countries in North Africa, westernized country. But how come this model produces this much number of fighters joining groups here and there? Well, if we look at the ages of these people in their 20s, they have all been educated in the last 20 years. It's the most darkest of the darkest period of Tunisia, where dictatorship was controlling the country in all respects, leaving no hope for youth to build a better future. So most of them, or some of them, left to Europe looking for opportunities. The others, they found other ways to go to, which are these groups, these terrorist groups. I think the political system has to do with generating this kind of ideas and this kind of environment. That's why I mentioned the establishing of dictatorships as part of the reasons behind those security threats. So we can't analyze this phenomena just back to the 5 or 6 years of the revolutions. We have to go a bit further back to the decades that produce this kind of environment and this kind of ideas.
Okay, that's a really good point. And